Olá pessoal, sejam muito bem-vindos ao podcast da Febratex 2024, o terceiro maior evento do setor têxtil do mundo e o maior das Américas. Eu sou Priscila Faiad, engenheira têxtil, e é um grande prazer ter vocês aqui e ser a host deste episódio. Hoje teremos dois convidados muito especiais, parceiros da Febratex, representando o ZDHC. Frank Michael, CEO do ZDHC, e Scott Eccles, CIO do ZDHC. O ZDHC, introduzindo antes de passarmos para o inglês, o ZDHC é um programa e uma certificação que propõe eliminar substâncias químicas e agressivas e perigosas para a indústria têxtil. So, welcome Frank and Scott to Febratex 2024.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
First of all, for all of people who's watching us and don't know about ZDHC, please introduce the program, what you do for the companies and how it works.
Let me tell you a little story. So I got a phone call in 2014 and a headhunter was asking me, Frank, would you be interested in taking a job in the fashion industry? And they invited me to New York, and I thought I made it. It was during the time of the Fashion Week in New York, and this is where I met these people working in sustainability in fashion, and they were talking about the MRSL, Manufacturing Restricted Substances. And I have like a history in fast-moving consumer goods and product compliance, but I didn't quite know what this was. And they asked me, could you imagine implementing this MRSL in the industry? It's looking at a different scope, and in product compliance you look at products from a target market perspective. Does this material meet the market standards? So this is restricted substance list. But the MRSL was just looking at the recipe, so the process chemistry, and discussing this with all these people in New York, just interesting. But then on the other hand, people were laughing at me. They said, just Frank, do you really think, and we're talking about thousands of factories, you can go to these factories and take that list and say, well, these chemicals are not supposed to be used. So they're really laughing at me. And but there was a history before these MRSL came into place, and Scott, he's kind of the grandfather of this MRSL idea, and maybe he can give a little bit upfront what happened before they had the idea of actually getting someone on board to implement the whole thing.
I prefer father to grandfather, but I'll take it. My experience was a little bit different. I come from a background of chemistry and environmental chemistry, and probably 25 years ago was called by a brand and they wanted to know something about the chemicals that were in their product, and so started working on an RSL, the actual restricted substances in the product, and spent about 10 years doing that, and was at Nike at the time in their product sustainability. And it was about this time of year in 2011, it was like August, most people were on vacation, and a Greenpeace campaign came out on media. It was on social media, it was on TV in some places, and they were campaigning against Nike and other brands for using certain chemicals, certain things like, you might have heard of PFAS, fluorinated water repellents. And so quickly we were told to act because they were doing, they were campaigning actively and rappelling off our building in Amsterdam, and they were campaigning in front of the windows of some of the other brands. And while we'd all tried to work individually for several years on our own lists and trying to control what was going on in the supply chain, it was very difficult, even a brand as large as Nike. And so one of the very first things we did was we called our colleagues at other brands, at Adidas and at Puma, H&M, and said, look, we need to actually work together on this, because keeping chemicals out of products and ultimately out of the factories is not a competitive issue. And the only way we're going to solve this is by working on it together, because everybody's using the same factories, you're getting materials from the same locations. And so we came together as 6 brands in late 2011 and kind of sat around and thought, well, we need to come up with a restricted list that they can't use in the factories. And so that's where we started this idea of an MRSL. And we did that for about 3.5 to 4 years, managing it ourselves, and had some consulting help in organizing the group. But you can imagine if you have Nike on one side of the table and Adidas on the other and Puma sitting at the end, and somebody wants to make a decision, everybody wants the decision made their way. So we all realized that we needed to have an organization. It couldn't just be the brands running it in your spare time from all your regular work. And so that's when we looked into how to set up a foundation. And that was the time when they went out and luckily found someone with Frank's background to bring in to help us set up the organization. And so in the early days in 2015, when it became a foundation, there was 4 of us, Frank and myself and 2 other people. And we had at the time, I think, 15 brands and a few chemical suppliers, so we were quite small. And now, fast forward to 2024, we have over 330 contributors. We have 70 to 80 of the major brands and retailers around the globe. And so we've grown quite large, and we've grown to over 60 in staff now around the globe. And so what we really wanted to do was align on what we were asking the supply chain, because in things like color of a fabric or the tensile strength.
Stop. Let's not go.
I was just going to say that you've got this. Everybody's got the same standards, so we wanted to align.
He's getting carried away. He's getting carried away. I can see it. He's going from we started with 4, and then we 330. But there's a story in between.
But there is a story.
There's a story in between.
I'll let Frank pick up on that.
But it was a big challenge, right?
It was
very big challenge.
It was a fun challenge, but it was a big challenge. I wouldn't call it challenge. I think just seeing those people in the room, and as Scott said, they all wanted to make the decision. One of the biggest challenges really was to get the acceptance in the room and the trust that there is an organization that can actually take care of it. And for brands to let go, but also at the same time, it's not just a brand's world. So Scott mentioned the chemical suppliers. Yeah, I mean, the program heavily affects the chemical suppliers, because let's go back to that story about this manufacturing restricted substance list and this drama about factories not having the chemical expertise that they can actually exclude these chemicals from being used. So these factories said to us, they said, look, Frank, can you just tell us which chemical products we can use that actually are not using these banned compounds in the recipe? I was like, yeah, that's okay. But then we need something like the Amazon of all the textile and leather chemicals. So that was the idea, just like, okay, we can do this, but you need to get the chemical industry on board. So then the next step was, we had 4 people. So how can you implement or even meet the expectation on a global level to bring something like the MRSL in factories? So you need to get the solution providers. There are big players in there who have factory contacts. So how can you convince them to actually work with us? And of course the manufacturers, those are the ones where we make the impact. If we don't have the manufacturers on board, and something about the manufacturers is quite difficult. I mean, they look at brands because they want business, and they just tell brands, okay, tell us what you want, and we do it. It doesn't quite do the trick for us. And when we look at the suppliers, this is where we really make the impact. And listening to them, one thing was, okay, can you actually do something and tell us the products? We did this. The next thing was, and Scott mentioned this very briefly, we had conversations with factories, and they said, Frank, this MRSL idea is amazing, but it's just an additional list because every single brand has their own MRSL. And what they did, they ripped the front page off the MRSL that they created together and put their own logo on. I went to the factory and said, we want you to implement this. And these factories said, are you crazy? Just everyone comes with a different list without understanding it was the same list. And it was a big learning effect from them to actually learn that the more logos are on the front page, the more powerful this instrument becomes. And this is kind of the success story, what I'd say is converging the industry efforts. And I think it took us quite some time until the big players actually took their own MRSL out of the market because there is no competition. I am not more sustainable than, and even big players like Inditex and H&M, they don't have the buying power to really get these lists established everywhere. So it was the convergence of the MRSL that was the first big win for ZDHC when we started. The next point is really converging the approaches on how you implement something in the industry, because these factories get audits from everywhere, just like they're conflicting audits. And when I'm listening to these stories from the factory owners, it almost makes me cry because it doesn't create impact. And when we spoke to brands, they said, Frank, why do you always want us to use your tools? We have more effective tools, and why do you want us to do this? I said, you may have more effective and better tools, but you're just acting alone, and by having your competitor doing the same, you're just duplicating. So why don't we make our tools better so that we improve, they become as good as your tools? So convergence was really the key success factor. And the same thing appears to the chemical suppliers. Chemical suppliers had so many requirements, different certificates, and what we felt, we need to build a story on how you create a story of the excellence in sustainable chemistry manufacturing, and to benchmark activities where we said, do we just look at the product, at the chemical product, or do we look at the way on it, how it's being produced? Just imagine you have the product that meets the ZDHC MRSL requirements, but they are not producing in a responsible way and they are discharging their waste in the backyard. Cannot be really in our interest. So we really looked at the aspect that the product meets the requirements. We looked at product stewardship, that they have processes in place, and we also looked at responsible production as a wider sense in terms of defining that story. Chemical industry didn't love us from the beginning, not quite, because it creates some transparency in the market, and you could see those that were performing better and those that weren't. And to become very stringent as a program, it unfortunately is that we have to say trust and verify, because the credibility of the organization is the most important. Because even if we are pushing our stakeholders, which doesn't create harmony in the room, but at the same time it creates the respect and the trust that this organization is purpose-driven. And when we are talking about the definition, we don't have members. So we have contributors, and that's a different point, because members, in membership organizations, you always work towards the smallest common denominator to get quorum in the room and to move on. In a purpose-driven organization, you can actually act in the interest of the organization, which is the purpose of eliminating discharge instead of making your members happy. It did quite take some time to educate that we're not working on membership happiness, but that we're working on the impact of the organization. And in return, it actually gives us the space that our stakeholders accept that we sometimes are acting against their business interest in order to push them across the border. For example, it's mandatory for brands to go through an assessment from KPMG, which is one of the big 5 accounting firms, how well they're implementing our program. So these are kind of components that we developed throughout the years, and now coming to the time warp 2024. So we had like this implementation showcase in 2018 where we showed, oh, this is how you implement the MRSL. So it's the products that meet the requirements, and you have a report and how you can show the factories are performing towards this MRSL with their inventories. We look at the verification on water, and water is really the key component of our program. Clean water was the driver, and when we look at water pollution and water consumption, I mean, how far away is biodiversity? Not at all. How can you separate pollution with diversity and biodiversity? How can you exclude discussions around climate change and greenhouse gas reduction when the wet processing is the high impact area? But have you ever seen that anyone is talking about chemistry in their sustainability reports? No. Why?
Wow.
It's confusing to people.
Yes, it's very confusing for people. And I can imagine this challenge in 2011, because today in 2024 we have a resistance. And imagine it more than 10 years ago, right? But you started with big companies, right? Big brands, right? It was easier or harder to go on, you know? Can you?
I think in the early days of the program, the brands that had joined were the ones that were the most experienced at already having programs in place. So the challenge there was getting them to give up their own program and accept the one of the group. And as later brands came on board, they were able to learn from that because they didn't have to recreate all the processes and tools that the brands had created initially. They were able to adopt those faster. So I think that now when smaller brands come on, I think the challenge is their bandwidth of the person that's in charge of the program for the brand. They may be looking at social aspects, environmental aspects, legal compliance aspects, and it's hard for them to have enough mind space to actually work on all those effectively. But I think where they really have an advantage is they're able to take the tools that we have, which are all publicly available, and start to implement those tools. They don't have to develop them internally and spend the time and effort that the brands did in the early days to develop those. And I think that one other thing, as Frank was talking, we try to be aspirational and push people, but we also are very pragmatic. We're not trying to set a standard that's so high that we know nobody can meet it and that it would mean you'd have to stop manufacturing products. So we're trying to be proactive, but at the same time put a standard out there that people can work towards and notify people that here's where challenges are, here's some innovation that needs to be done for a particular process. So we try to be, look ahead, be aspirational, but really be pragmatic and set targets that are actually achievable on the supply chain.
There's a very fine line between aspiration and greenwash.
Yeah.
So it is a frustration if it's too unrealistic. You get a disconnect. That's why we had a debate with Greenpeace at the beginning that they said your MRSL is not ambitious enough, but we said our MRSL has the narrative that all these compounds that we have on the MRSL, safer alternatives, are available, and there is no excuse that they cannot be implemented. Instead of looking at fragments of toxins that we believe don't create really the megatons in impact. So by being so pragmatic, we even got the recognition from Greenpeace, and I couldn't believe it. I noted in the calendar about 2 years ago, they actually recommended us as the program who has the potential to scale the detoxing of the fashion industry, which was a big compliment, and at the same time was putting a lot of burden on our shoulders. And our mantra is our job's far from done. And when we're talking about the discharge of chemicals, I mean, this is not just a fashion industry issue. We're sharing supply chain with the automotive industry. We're sharing with consumer electronics. So it's kind of a transforming process of supply chains where we get the recognition that taking a focus on the input, the process chemistry, is a game changer. And we are possibly just at the beginning of that story.
Yes. And do you have cases and data to talk about the members that you could bring a better results with the program about the implementing?
We have two really nice instruments, and because everything is about transparency and to show who really takes care of their supply chains. So we have what we call a detox fashion radar, which you find in the internet. Go to our site or just basically Google detox fashion radar, and you see whenever you're operating with a limited visibility, we have this Nautic radar, and then towards the middle you have the high performing brands. So you see the screen and the cursor is going around, and you see in the middle the top performing brands, and you can click on them and you see the history of them within our program, how well they are performing. And when you go one step further, you go into our Detox Live map. So Detox Live shows all the factories that are engaging in our program, and it shows which components of our program they're in, and we also know how well they're performing. So that's the next step of the story, really to connect those tools, that we have the transparency, that also customers and people that are interested look at these instruments and say, okay, now I can make an informed decision. Because when I'm being asked, I tell that story to my friends, my family, they say, Frank, it's interesting, where can I buy? The first question, where can I buy? And this is supposed to be the starting seed for the information to educate consumers where they can buy. And even again, our job's far from done. And I would say those brands that are not on the radar, they have the issue. It's not those that are not close to the middle, because every one of those, for one or the other reason, is not in the center. But it's interesting to see how they're engaging and how passionate they are in the program. So I would always say, if you're not on the radar, they have a problem.
Yeah. Okay, it was amazing. Congratulations for the program. It's amazing, really amazing. Textile industry needs it. So, do you have a message, a final message for us?
The final message is, don't forget chemistry. Even if you don't talk about it, but it is the backbone of all sustainability activities, and you cannot talk about water stewardship or fancy climate change programs if you don't control the baseline, which is chemicals.
Yeah, if you can't keep the chemicals from polluting the water, you can't have biodiversity, you can't have clean drinking water, safe water. And I think that the thing I tell people is just get started, because a lot of brands will look at this and say, oh, there's a lot of work to do and I don't know where to start. And it's really start somewhere. Get to know your supply chain, know where your materials are coming from, and know what chemicals are being used on your products. And that's the place to start for anyone.
All the program is free available. Just the resources are freely available. You can, as Scott said, you can start now. So we believe that we give the industry the standard and the tools that they can implement, and they can do it free of cost. When they want to engage in the program and want to use our tools, this is where we need to talk.
Yes. So it's free for education, right?
Yes. Yep.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Obrigado.
De nada. Ficamos por aqui, pessoal. Hoje encerramos o podcast da Febratex 2024. Amanhã temos mais programação por aqui.